11, and I hate to be late, so I'm gonna have to buzz out at 9:30. So I want to get started on time.
No, he's right here.
Well, I've been there about 8 months. It's been quite a learning experience for me. I want you all come on in, folks. There's still room here. Well, I've been reading all the legislation, number one, and I've been voting the way I feel that people in northern Michigan would want me to vote. We have been receiving about 3,000 communications a week from people throughout the district, and hopefully my staff has been responding to all of them. I do get an update every day. You know, we get them a summary of the day's communication, where on a certain issue they may say we have 85 people wrote in on this subject, 65 thought this way, 20 thought this other way. So I've been pretty busy doing all that. I guess my biggest frustration, to tell you the truth, has been the Senate. We've passed a lot of stuff in the House. We've had a lot of open debate. We've had an open amendment, fairly open amendment process where, you know, for example, on the budget, we had over 200 amendments, Democrat amendments, Republican amendments, put forth on our House budget that ended up being passed. The Senate, however, didn't pass the budget, and you know, we ended up having a deadline, having this continuing resolution, and it's been very frustrating because the Senate hasn't really passed anything. You know, the way it's supposed to be is that we're supposed to pass something in the House. The Senate's supposed to pass a budget in the Senate, and then we work together, you know, in a conference committee to come up with a plan that both houses will approve of and then pass. However, they haven't done that.
Can't you?
What's happened?
Can't you be more like the Senate and not pass so many laws?
Well, we do have to fund the government. You know, like what's happening here now, for example, is that the government will be out of money again at the end of the month.
Can I have a follow-up on that? Because I just watched the news about these billions and billions of dollars in Iraq and Afghanistan. It was all fraud by these contractors that never built any churches, they didn't build any schools or anything, but they're still getting paid these billions of dollars. And to be quite frank, that kind of irritates me.
Kind of irritates me too.
Yeah, I think if you look at a lot of the waste and the fraud,
yeah,
you would have to cut entitlements, Social Security, Medicare,
well,
or any of that.
I don't know what to tell you. I voted against the defense appropriation bill. I voted to stop funding for Libya. I voted to get our people out of Afghanistan. I voted to get our people out of Iraq. I think the defense budget has a lot of cuts. I got about a 5-minute presentation on the debt, and then I'll be open to all your questions. The federal debt problem. Well, going back.
Right there on the top, right, there's a point to it, right there.
I don't know. What I'm saying is that we got a debt problem. Okay, under Mr. Bush, he had deficits of $400 billion. Look at this is $500 billion here. So he had a tremendous amount of debt, which I thought was, you know, way overboard. This is the you know, the war. Now under Mr. Obama, we've got even more debt.
What portion of that is TARP?
Well, I'm not sure what portion of it is TARP. A lot of it is the stimulus.
What portion is the Bush tax cuts?
Well, we're gonna run through a lot of it here. So going forward, you can see that we had a $1.5 trillion deficit in 2009, a $1.5 trillion deficit in 2010, nearly over $1 trillion deficit in 2011, and then we have nearly $1 trillion deficit going forward for the next 10 years. This is on top of our $14 trillion debt that we have right now. The debt held by the public as a percentage of the gross domestic product. We've had debt in the past in this country. In the Second World War, we had debt that approached 100 and exceeded a little bit 100% of the gross domestic product. That's because we were borrowing money to win the war. We borrowed money from Americans, and then we paid it back after the war. You know, my mother had a bunch of war bonds. Many of you may have had the same, and they paid that off. And then we went down to a relatively low rate of debt. Mr. Reagan borrowed a lot of money. He built up the military, so our debt came up there. And then, since 2010, this is what's going to happen to our debt under current policy. So this has got to change. Okay, and there's lots of people who have ideas about how to do it. Right now, for every dollar the federal government spends, they're borrowing actually 42 cents. So that can't go on. Otherwise you get that graph that we saw back there where the debt just keeps rising and rising and rising. You and I can't live like this. This is, you know, pretty soon if you spend this much money, somebody comes and takes away all your stuff. Who owns our debt? Well, as late as 1970, 95% of our debt was held by Americans. Treasury bonds, you know, savings bonds, that sort of thing. Only 5% of our debt was held by foreigners. In 1990, 19% of our debt was held by foreigners. Today, about 47% of our debt is held by foreigners, the majority of that being the Chinese, the Japanese, the British, and many other countries. This puts us in a difficult situation internationally, economically, militarily, strategically, because we can't really negotiate with people when it's like arguing with your banker when you owe him $1 million. You don't have much to stand on. We need to get our debt under control. How does the government spend your money? Okay, there's two categories of government spending. There's what they call mandatory spending, which is 65% of the budget. This is stuff that's already been voted into law, and which, unless we change the underlying law, you know, I don't have any much say in it. I mean, if you get to be, you know, 65 or 62, you're eligible for Social Security automatically. If you're 65 and you paid into Medicare, you're eligible for Medicare. Medicaid, there's certain eligibility requirements. Interest, we have to pay that. Mandatory spending is Medicaid, veterans benefits, a few other items. This is what they call the discretionary spending. This is 35% of our budget. The defense discretionary spending and the non-defense. This is money that goes through the congressional appropriations every year. In other words, in Congress, we vote on spending money in these areas. And this is what this part of the budget has been really a problem. As I said before, you know, we've been passing some stuff that cuts this, but the Senate hasn't done anything. So it's standing up in the air, and like I say, this part of the budget is going to be, you know, up at the end of September 30th. The continuing resolution that we passed earlier this year to fund the government through the fiscal year expires. And although for fiscal year 2012, which starts on October 1st, we've been through in the House the process of assigning spending, but the Senate hasn't done anything like that. Medicare spending consists of hospital inpatient services, Medicare Advantage, home health, physician payments. You know, as a physician, I've been receiving payments from Medicare patients for 30 years. And it's sort of surprising to see that the payments to physicians account for only 13% of the Medicare spending. But going forward, all the cuts to Medicare come from this part of it.
It'd be interesting to know how much goes to the insurance industry.
What's that?
It'd be interesting
Well,
to know.
that, see, this Medicare Advantage,
Right.
that's that.
That's a big piece of the pie.
Well, this is an optional portion in Medicare where you
That
can
was to
decide.
that was to incentivize the insurance companies to provide the Medicare Advantage plans, which is a Medicare plus private insurance.
Right.
And they would operate it, and they're getting reimbursed an additional percentage for that.
Well,
To incentivize it, I believe that.
as I understand it, this Medicare Advantage is actually costing us less than expected based on its percentage of usage. So this has been actually a success. Medicare Advantage has been a relatively successful
That's successful.
program. Social Security spending is mostly retired people, spouses and children, widows, and disabled workers. Defense spending, as you can imagine, most of it is for operations, maintenance, personnel is a large part, purchases, research and development, and construction. Other mandatory spending, like I said before, welfare and food stamps, civilian and military retirement, veterans benefits, housing, agriculture, and some other social services are included in that. Foreign aid spending, which is something that people always mention to me, why don't we just stop sending money across the seas and then we'll solve our budget problems. That accounts for 1% of the budget. Medicare and Social Security combined like 33%. So 1/3 of our spending goes to Social Security and Medicare. The Budget Control Act of 2011, this is the last sort of controversial bill that was passed that raised the debt ceiling this last time. I voted for this bill, but it's not a very good bill. All right, I much prefer what they call the cut, cap, and balance. We passed that in the House. That bill would have required much more immediate cuts than were taken. Caps on the short-term future, and then required the passage of a balanced budget amendment. This Budget Control Act doesn't cut as much as that bill does, but the cut, cap, and balance was tabled by the Senate. They didn't call a vote on it. They didn't debate it. And this is the only bill that we could get the Senate to look at. This bill cuts about $1 trillion over the next 10 years. It only cuts about $21 billion for fiscal year 2012. It caps future spending over the next 10 years, and then it has this 12-member joint committee that's supposed to identify another $1.2 trillion to cut over the next 10 years. I don't really like this, but this is something that the Senate insisted upon having in the law before they would even consider passage of it. If the committee does not find $1.2 trillion, then this law cuts spending across the board, including a lot of defense spending and a lot of cuts into Medicare. This option, if this committee does not act, is sort of a draconian method of cutting spending over the next 10 years. Nobody wants to go to this option. What this bill also does, though, is it requires a vote on a constitutional amendment for a balanced budget amendment. Because the Senate, we did pass in the House a constitutional amendment to for a balanced budget amendment, but the Senate hasn't acted on that.
Would that have an exception if you go to war
Yes.
or a recession?
No, there's a provision for if you go to war or a national declared emergency.
But doesn't give any exceptions for recessions?
A national declared emergency is the way it's worded, as
Excuse me now, but there's an important part here that comes out. How do you define war? Korea
it's a
wasn't a war,
declaration of
Vietnam wasn't a war, Iraq wasn't a war, Afghanistan wasn't a war.
I agree with you, but I believe it's a declaration of war.
All this is an open-ended end just to keep spending and spending. They can say we're at war continuously
No, but
forever.
it's going to require, as I understand it, a declaration of war. I mean, I agree with you. I don't believe we should be putting troops overseas without a declaration of war. I was against Mr. Bush's sending people to Iraq without a declaration of war. I think, you know, that we can't be doing this.
Let me ask you a follow-up question, and apologize for, but I was one of these guys who was drafted during Korea. Okay, I wasn't a happy camper, but let me tell you that. It irritates the hell out of me to see that they're paying these so-called contractors $10,000 a week. And I got my grandson's home from Iraq now, okay? My granddaughter's home from Afghanistan. But they were hiring contractors over there to protect our dignitaries that went over there. Do you mean to tell me that our Rangers and our SEALs and our servicemen can't protect the people that we send over there? Why are we paying private contractors to protect our own people? I don't buy that a bit.
I think it's a matter of personnel. They need personnel, and they just don't have enough people in the service to do that mission, as I understand it.
I respectfully disagree with you. You know, I mean, if they don't have enough people over there, I mean, hey, I got my grandson he was sending me back all of this stuff. You can't put our own soldiers protecting our senators and congressmen when they go over there? I have a problem with that. I really seriously do. Like, we hire these contractors and then find out all of the things that they get engaged in becomes pretty questionable.
Yeah, no, I understand.
It's all about the money.
Well, that's all I wanted to say. This is my website, benishek.house.gov. If you go there, then you'll see what I'm doing. You'll be able to see what I voted on. You'll be able to, write in, with your comments and your criticisms. So I would appreciate you, doing that.
I hope you don't take it as criticism.
No, I want to hear what
It's
you
just-
have to say. That's why I'm here today. So with that, after this presentation, then I'd be happy to listen to what you have to say. Yes, sir.
Two questions. One is, the Constitution doesn't allow you to pass bills that keep my sons and daughters and grandchildren in debt. It only allows you to pass bills that come to the end of your term. Is my understanding. Is that correct?
Well, we do have this debt.
I understand that.
The 65% of the budget is already in law, and unless we change that law somehow, that money is going to be continuing to be spent. And that 65% is rising at a rate that is going to overspend us.
I understand that. But that is forcing my children to pay what is brought on my. Why can't we just cut it off? Do whatever you have to do to cut it off, so that the next Congress only passes what they have to do for that day, not continue the debt onward. That was my first question to you. The second question is, why don't you just get rid of the EPA? I mean,
Well, the number one issue, what I feel is the number one issue, okay, is jobs, is the employment, is the economy, all right? And the way the federal government is dealing with policy in this country is that they've let the EPA sort of run amok. I mean, they're writing regulations that don't have any basis in the underlying legislation. And I agree with you that the EPA that's part of the reason why our industry and our unemployment is so high. Because
so can you put forth
people in this country who want to invest money, they have to change their way, their business practices to, for example, smokestack emissions. They have to scrub their smokestack emissions to provide for better.
So can you author a bill that does away with that?
Well, what we're trying to do is to decrease the funding. See, the administration are the people that direct the function of the EPA. In other words, the executive department directs how the EPA works. Now, we've had the EPA for what? Several decades, right? It's just,
Under Nixon.
well, that is under Nixon.
Right.
Yes.
Okay, so then, you know, that we've had regulations from the EPA right along. It's just that it seems that lately they're writing a lot more regulations, and they don't really take into the account the cost ratio. In other words, they'll write a regulation without really taking into account what it will cost to implement those regulations. And the costs on people, municipalities, you know, small local municipalities, county road commissions, city government, business, they have added costs due to these regulations. For example, I have somebody in St. Ignace, the road commission in St. Ignace. I just had a meeting with them where they're trying to just clear the culverts, you know, from their county roads, and now they've got the EPA involved in, you know, them clearing the culverts of a county road that they've been clearing for the last 50 years, but now they've got new regulations where they're non-compliant. They've been doing the same thing for 50 years.
So you mentioned scrubbers on smokestacks. Would you advocate removing scrubbers from smokestacks?
No, but when you implement a regulation that changes the quality of the smoke that's supposed to be coming out, some of the rules that are coming out, for example, limit the percentage, like parts per million of a contaminant, to a level that is undetectable by current technique. Like, you know, 1 part per billion, for example. Like they regulate dioxin.
Sure.
And like, for example, I'm not sure exactly if
I
this
mean, he's advocating wiping out EPA, which is absolutely extreme.
I don't think that's right. But I mean, when you go from a percentage of, like, say, 10 parts per billion of dioxin to 0.1 parts per billion of dioxin, you can't even detect that by current techniques. And then when you implement a regulation that costs a company $20 million, okay?
But it saves the public health.
Well, yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
Okay,
right.
But you regulate it where it costs them $20 million over the next 3 years.
Right.
And then halfway through that process, you change the regulation again so that it costs them another $20 million. So they cannot plan for a period of 10 years. So a company then does not want to invest. They just rather close the mill and do it in Indonesia.
Mr. Thompson, let me respond to that.
You know what I mean? So it's a problem.
Yeah, my sense is that you're picking apart little things here and there that may be a little off. But overall, we ought to say in this room, the EPA has improved the quality of life for American people. You're crazy. You're crazy.
Hey, listen.
You're absolutely wrong.
I'm here to listen to what you have to say. Okay?
Yeah.
So I'd rather not have you all get into an argument amongst each other.
Crazy.
Okay.
No, I'm not.
But there needs to be a reasonableness.
Right.
Okay.
Right. I understand.
And there needs to be a consistency, though, so that people can plan. Not have the regulation change year by year, so that people can't plan their expenses over time.
I understand it.
Yes, sir.
Sir, a better example of scrubbers is there's the Keystone XL pipeline will be delivering 1 million barrels of oil from Canada to our refineries in Oklahoma and Texas. And the State Department actually wrote the EIS for that. I think it was the EIS. And it was approved. And the problem is, it's not the EPA, it's not the laws, it's the public getting involved in it. Daryl Hannah was arrested in front of the White House just recently protesting this pipeline. This pipeline is going to deliver 1 million barrels of oil a day. It's something like 20% of all the oil that's coming from Canada is coming down this pipeline. And so it's not the laws, it's not the EPA, it's not the DNR, it's not the government, it's the public ability to manipulate the government. And they can do it. You know, you could, Forest Service, I used to work with Forest Service.
Sure.
You can stop anything that the Forest Service wants to do, anything, with a postcard. That's all it takes, is one postcard. So I think the problem is, the law has allowed a minority to manipulate our government and our regulators, and that's the problem.
Well, let me give you an
Mr.
example.
Thomas, let me, and I hate to push on this, but
Wait, I'd like to
I know, but
let
this
everybody
is
have an
important.
opportunity. Let me just ask this young lady.
Okay.
Because I want to let everybody have an opportunity
Sure, I
to ask
understand.
a question.
Well, I think one reason that people all of a sudden are concerned, I mean, we're all concerned, is, I mean, we're in the Ottawa National Forest, and this is a huge part of, I mean, this is our backyard. It's my backyard, and it's most of our backyard. And it's a great resource for us up here, and it's very special, and where we want to see it preserved, okay? And I understand you're on the House Natural Resource Committee.
Yes, ma'am.
So obviously you have a lot of say and power into what's happening up here, too. My question for you is, I haven't been able to find anything out about your view on human effect on global warming, which is part of what we're all talking about here, and regulations and trying to have a clean environment for our future kids and grandkids and great-grandkids.
Well,
So I'm curious to know what your take on that is.
Well, you know, I grew up in Iron River.
Right, I knew
And
that.
I live,
Right.
in the woods between
Right.
Crystal Falls and Iron River. And
So we have a common,
And I
yeah.
want the federal forest to be here, forever.
right,
But I do want us to be able to use the timber in the federal forest to create jobs.
sure,
And use the federal forest for recreation, hunting and fishing and,
right.
hiking and all that.
But there has to be rules
Right now,
about
it's
timbering.
just about
Yeah.
impossible to cut trees down in the federal forest.
Well, that's not true.
Yes, it is.
No.
I'm telling you.
There is a big Beaton's Lake where I
Can you
live.
listen to me
No,
for
no,
a minute?
no. That's not true.
Can you listen to me?
Sure,
for a minute?
Okay.
sure, I'll be glad to.
Okay, they start a timber cutting process in the federal forest, it takes them over 8 years on average to get that piece of timber cut. Okay, they decide to put up an area for bids. From the time they decide to put up an area for bids, it takes them, because of the process, over 8 years to get that piece of timber sold. Whereas in the state forest, it takes something less than 2 years. And on the county forest, something less than a year. Even though the state forest and the county forest, for the most part, have an independent sustainability growth certification. Okay, federal forest doesn't have that. Okay, there's independent certification for state forest and county forest that they're managed in a sustainable fashion. And there's a couple of different certification processes, independent of the state or the county. Now, there's a lot of jobs being tied up in the fact that they can't cut trees down in the federal forest.
Well, I'm
Okay?
on the Beaton's Lake,
So-
and they have a forestry plan. It's 3 years, and they're logging next year. So
Well,
yeah,
what I'm saying is
Yeah.
that on average, it takes over
Right.
8 years. And that most
Okay.
people that are
That's
trying
right.
to get timber, they've given up on the federal forest. The other thing about it is that every time the federal forest sells timber, they lose money. Okay? Anybody who owns timber might have an idea, and I have some timberland. When we sell our timber, I make money so I can pay my taxes or improve my property, whatever. The process that the federal government uses to sell their timber is so convoluted and expensive that it actually costs them money to sell their timber.
okay.
Which
Could
that
you
whole
answer that?
process
Yeah.
has to be streamlined. Now, I've introduced some legislation which we call a predeterminational review. In other words, if the Forest Service, because somebody at the end of the process can stop the cut by, filing a lawsuit. Right, so the process can go on for 6 years, the sale, and somebody at the end of that process can then file a lawsuit to create an injunction to stop the sale. So
Any chance you'd answer a question?
About global warming?
No, what
About
global?
the human, what, I want to know what your beliefs
I'm not
are.
sure what the human.
Well, and you're on that
process
committee and you
global
don't have
warming
a
is.
point of
I
view?
don't know that I want to spend $1 trillion to, stop global warming when I'm not sure what the cause of global warming is.
You still don't know the cause, okay. Very interesting.
Mr. Congressman,
Yes, sir.
Is there any way in either the House or the Senate that we could stop the administration from these back end roads? I mean, cap and trade was tabled in the Senate, so there's executive orders to the EPA to pretty much enforce what cap and trade would have done. The DREAM Act was killed in the House and the Senate, and then there's executive orders to ICE to pretty much enact what the DREAM Act was done. That's my first question. And then the second question is, you co-sponsored House Resolution 822. It's the National Reciprocity to Carry handguns throughout the states. Where's that at?
Well, it hasn't passed the House. I think it's still in committee, that handgun bill.
Okay.
And like this regulatory thing that you're talking about, where they create law by writing these regulations, is very frustrating to me. But that's up to the administration. It's very difficult to put a stop to that, other than defunding the portion of the administration that actually does
Like
that.
the ICE directive came from the Department of Justice, and to pretty much enact and tie ICE's hands. So I mean, that is the
Well,
administration.
the problem is, as I said before, that we've passed a lot of stuff in the House. That doesn't change, the Senate hasn't.
Just came out.
No, I'm happy to pass something in the House and have the Senate pass something that's different from us. And then, have a conference. What's been happening, and you've seen it over and over this year, is that nothing will happen until some deadline comes along. Okay? And then the Senate agrees to talk to the leadership of the House, and the leadership of the House and the leadership of the Senate get together in some room, and then they do something, and then they throw it out in front of us with like a week to go, or like 3 days to go, or sometimes 2 hours for the deadline, and then make us decide whether we're going to vote for it. And that process is very frustrating. See, to me, we're trying to do our job, which you may agree with the things we pass in the House, or you may disagree with. Then the Senate, is there to pass their thing, and then we come to some sort of agreement and move along. But they haven't been doing their job. It's very frustrating to me.
On that point,
Yes, sir.
though, it seems to me that what you're passing is a known that it will go nowhere. It's like you're holding up the process. And then you're saying, well, we're passing things, but they're not.
Then have them pass something.
Okay.
Well, they have, like for example with the budget. Everybody argues that the budget that we passed is, our budget that we passed brings us out of debt in over 40 years. Okay? It doesn't raise taxes on anybody. It slowly cuts everything. But then why don't the Senate pass the budget?
On that, I guess that was
You know what I
really
mean?
what I keep asking is there's an article in Newsweek this week where it says the S&P was reacting to the systemic cause of America's budget problems, and the cause the S&P noted was political.
Yep.
The author of the article thought that ideological would be more appropriate. And he goes on to quote, it springs from a fantasy of the Republican right that governments can operate without revenue, more precisely, that a government presiding over an expanding economy. And as you pointed out, an aging population can operate without increases in revenue. And why are you so against increases in revenue? The Bush tax cuts are responsible for a large part of the deficit right now.
Well,
They really are. I think
I don't really,
2009
let me say this.
Congressional Budget Office,
People don't really understand the level of spending involved. You could tax people who make over $200,000 on 100% of their income.
But why-
And it will not change the fact that we're overspending. If you send more
Well,
money
they
to
will
Washington,
reduce the
they will
deficit.
spend it.
It will reduce the
They,
deficit.
they will spend it.
How do you propose to?
We have to cut the spending.
Medicaid and education.
Well, we
What are
do
you
have,
supposed to do about those?
we do have plans
EPA.
to try to assess, to try to do that. And
Private
we can't, you must be, maybe you're familiar with what they call a defined benefit plan versus a defined contribution plan. Okay? For example, in my practice, we've had a pension plan for 30 years. Okay? My employees get a pension plan. The corporation gives them, as an employment benefit, a percentage of their salary every year. At the end of the year, we make a contribution to their pension plan every year. All right? And when they retire finally, whatever they have in that plan is theirs. And along the whole way, it's theirs. Okay? But we don't guarantee that they're going to get $1,000 a month plus health care for the rest of their lives. Okay? Because we can't fiscally maintain that guarantee. When they're done working for me, I'm done paying into their pension plan, and the same thing happened to me. Whatever is there is there. The government and a lot of major corporations have guaranteed people in their pension plans with Social Security a certain benefit that they can't afford. It put GM out of, nearly out of business. It's made every single state government and every school board in a situation where they can't afford anything. And that's the situation that faces Social Security and Medicare. They promise them something that they can't afford to produce. I mean, right now, when they started Social Security, for example, you get Social Security at 65. This is back in 1934 or whatever, right? The average person lived to 62. So most people didn't get any of that benefit. It was sort of an insurance if you lived a long time. Now, almost everybody gets that benefit. Back then, 1934, there were 159 people paying into the program for every person that was taking out. Now, there's 3 people paying into the program for every person taking out. In 10 years, there will be only 2 people paying into the program. Well, the program is fiscally irresponsible, will be bankrupt in 10 years unless we do something.
But why are taxes off the table? I don't understand.
Because my feeling is that if you send more money to Washington, they're going to spend it somehow. I mean, I'm in favor of reforming the tax laws, but you have to be very careful because right now, for example, we have like one of the highest corporate taxes in the world in this country.
Yeah, weren't they supposed to create jobs with that tax rate?
And there was
Which they haven't done in the...
Well, they created all kinds of jobs in
What I'm
China.
saying is that
What is it?
They're all gone to China. That's where all that money
Yeah.
goes.
Yeah.
people, like for example, I'll tell you this company that has a cement plant in Alpena, okay? They were thinking about putting a new cement plant in Washington State. $1 billion investment into a new cement plant in Washington State. But because of the fact that the corporate tax rates are higher, because that if they make money overseas, if they bring it back here, they're taxed the second time. They decided to build a cement plant in Indonesia.
But the effective tax rate in this country is more like 18%, which is pretty.
Well, I don't know where you get that number.
Well,
It's
that's
all
what
over
I've
the
been
news,
reading.
Excuse me, but
What they
All
actually
right,
pay.
what-
I worked in Wisconsin as a volunteer to Congressman Jim Sensenbrenner and what was his name, Pete Wilson. He was in Washington, and we worked on the deficit problems in our state of Wisconsin. And what happened is we got a surplus, and it was very huge, and they didn't know what to do with it. So what they did was they devised plans to use that the prosperity, the surplus that they established. And they didn't probably use it properly because what happened was that surplus then was eliminated and erased because of improper usage of that money. I think what they did was they created programs that were not cost effective, and what they did, instead of using the money like an investor would, an investor takes the money and he doesn't overspend, he controls it to a point where he's gaining prosperity, a minute amount of interest, where that becomes basically at a minute amount of interest, it's more money than they need. Like a wealthy man, when he invests his money, his interest is so much he can't even spend it. So what they did was they over-invested with their money to the point where they suffered back in the deficit and they've never recovered. So in evaluating that process, we're thinking that I'm thinking of prosperity of Michigan and the way everyone's complaining about this money and that money and this money and that money. And then even if the money was reestablished, would they even use it properly and was it prosperous means? I mean, that is the concern.
That's my concern too.
They're sitting there and saying they want, but are they going to take and use properly if it's established? Because I don't think it's that difficult to restore this deficit.
There was something on the news last night that I saw.
Properly, then it's going to go back into the deficit, and we're going to hear the same complaints again.
The waste, see, the problem at the federal level is that the waste is so unbelievable. I mean, like on the news,
Do they deserve it?
Mr. Klein pointed out there was 83 separate agencies that were devoted to teacher education. Well, come on. There need to be 83 separate agencies with separate bureaucracy, separate directors that are all directed toward the same thing. And believe me, when you go in front in these committees where you talk about these issues, the person from the department says, well, this is important. This is critical for our children's future. This is bang for the buck. This is a great investment. But they don't want their agency cut.
Yes,
And there's no money. We're borrowing 40 cents for every dollar. So
that's what you're saying, it's all waste and fraud, but then
there's
you
a
guys,
lot of it. I don't say a lot.
what I'm saying is, why are we cutting entitlements then for all our, all paid into this
Well, we're
stuff?
trying to do it. I mean, Mr. Klein's trying to cut
But you guys
42
are all
of those.
still, you're gonna, you wanna cut Social Security, you wanna cut Medicare.
We also have a
You're on the
$14
board.
trillion
If you
deficit.
guys look at all the
at the
waste
federal level.
in this country, what you just said is happening, that's just one instance, you wouldn't have this problem. I just, it boggles my mind why you guys would even think about something like that. Honest to God.
Well, the circumstance I mentioned to you before with the defined benefit plan versus the defined contribution plan is the basic problem with Social Security and Medicare. Because we promised a benefit that we can't afford to provide. Now, the Republican plan for that does not change Social Security or Medicare for anybody 55 years of age or older. For those 54 years of age or older, it turns it into a defined contribution plan, rather than a defined benefit plan.
What happens to the person that retires in 2008, end of 2009? His plan is gone. You're still going to have...
No, I'm saying is that for people 55 and older, there's no change.
No, my point is in that sort of situation where they lost, let's say, half of their plan, all their money, and now they're going to have half as much income or less than that, and they're going to be on welfare. You're going to have to provide for them some way at some point. Do you understand what I'm trying to say?
No, I understand it all. I mean, I understand that nobody can be guaranteed what they're going to get.
Exactly.
But if you've done it over 30, if you've invested your money over the last 30 years, you've in general probably done okay. Yes, sir.
First, I want to say how unhappy I am with the debt ceiling discussions. I am so unhappy. I am the middle class. I have invested so I could retire early. No Social Security yet, okay? I did exactly what I was supposed to do. And the markets went wild afterwards. I am livid about what happened there. And the Republicans in the House spent a week negotiating with themselves as the clock ticked. It was absolutely crazy. Your leader, Speaker of the House, walked out of negotiations, which would have been a better deal overall for reducing deficits over the long haul, right? Which included revenue streams, and instead you negotiated with yourself for a week. The bill passed, cut cap and balance, wasn't going to go anywhere. Everybody knew it. It lasted for 2 hours. And then we moved into negotiations while the whole world looked at the good faith and credit of America and said, what in the hell is going on in that country? We have passed 60 or 70 times, we've passed a debt ceiling increase. Now, I'm as fiscally as conservative as anybody in this room. Let's get that under control. But that's the wrong fight. And for the wrong reasons and carried out to extremes. Just absolutely crazy. So I don't want you to defend it. I saw it happen.
I'm just trying to. What is your alternative?
The negotiations with your speaker should have occurred earlier. And in fact, it didn't even have to occur. You could have raised the debt ceiling and picked another fight. But instead, you made us a laughingstock of the world. It is absolutely a sin.
Do you think we should have just passed the debt ceiling without any kind
We've done it 60 or 70 times before. I agree, let's get our deficit down. I agree. But it's the wrong fight when people have to worry that they're going to get paid the interest by our government. The good faith and credit of our government was on the line, and you guys played around with it. It was a wrong fight. So, now wait, that was the point I wanted to make. Now, you can point at other people. You can point at other people and say the Senate and everybody else. So you're a Republican, and let's talk about the Republicans' roles. And you've only been there a short period of time, so you don't carry the burden of all the bad decisions in the past. But the Republicans have made a lot of bad decisions. I have my beef with the Democrats. And I do the same. If you were a Democratic congressman, I do the same thing. But let's be realistic here. If you look, we had a surplus as Bush came in. There's a Social Security trust fund. We owe money to the trust fund that I paid into, that I want to draw on. When we had those surpluses, we could have paid down the debt. We could have positioned ourselves for the demographics of the boomers retiring. But no, we gave tax cuts in a really healthy economy. We gave tax cuts across the board. It was a wrong thing to do. Wrong. The Republicans led the way doing that. And then we went on a spending spree. Now the Afghan war, we had to do it. I agree. But we put it on a credit card. What were we thinking? You got to sacrifice if you're going to go to war. And then the Iraq war, our intelligence was based upon misinformation. I am just livid that that went on a credit card too. Republicans took us into that war based upon misinformation. It was wrong, and we didn't pay for it. Okay? Medicare Part D. Who got taken care of? Billy Touzan. You weren't even there at the time. Billy Touzan, who went to work for the pharmaceutical industries after he cut this deal, took care of the pharmaceuticals, and he took care of the insurance industry. And it bankrupted this country. That alone would bankrupt Medicare. Republicans ought to step forward and say, we are going to fix Medicare D. The Veterans Administration negotiates for drugs, but not Medicare D. And instead of taking care of instead of taking care of the constituents in the districts, we took care of the pharmaceuticals and the insurance industry. It was wrong. And the lack of financial oversight that took us into the collapse that occurred. It was at Alan Greenspan, you know, everybody gave him kudos. But what in the hell was going on that we could write subprime mortgages and now we can't get financial reform? We ought to have financial reform in this country. So the Republicans ought to step forward in the health care discussion. Now you could like it or not like it, but it was going to pass. The Republicans could have sat at the table and say, well, we don't really like it, but we want cost control. We are spending 17% of our GDP on health care. It is wrong. We can't do it. So, and then to hear the Republicans say, we don't even talk about tax increases. But all you care about is the deficit. Well, you got to increase taxes to pay for your wars and Medicare D and all these crazy decisions that occurred before, including the Republicans. So how can you take tax revenues off the table? I guess that's the... How can you do that?
Well, my position is that if you give it to them, they're going to keep spending it.
But we've got
and I'm happy to come to some sort of a solution. But let's see the Senate do something.
No, don't blame somebody else.
Well, we passed it.
It wasn't going to go anywhere. I made that point.
Yeah, but that's what you say. But how? So then what? So the only way you're going to get something done is if you pass something, they pass something, and you have a negotiation.
Which is what occurred in the end. But you could have done it before you went into that week of negotiations with yourself.
Since January. The problem is that
don't blame somebody else.
I'm standing here in front of you.
Your speaker walked away from negotiations.
I'm not sure what happened in there.
He walked away from negotiations.
Well, no, we've been putting our stuff right out there.
So don't tell me you're at the table, you're willing to work with. No, you walked away from negotiations. You're only 1/3 of the government, and you didn't do your part. That's
all right. Well, I appreciate your input,
Mr. Congressman.
Yes, sir.
Let me come back to EPA because it's important. Because all of the questions here relate around more or less the same issue. It's not the intent of the law. The intent of these laws are good. I've followed them all my life, okay? Most people don't know now that I can't read very good because of the problem, so I talk a lot, okay? That's how I get my information. But the EPA law is good law. It's the bureaucrats along the way that make the wrong interpretations that bankrupt you in the right decision, and then in the end they come up with the wrong decision. Now I'll give you some examples. John Stranzel was a logger, county commissioner, got killed in the woods. Dave Fisher, right here from Marinesco, got killed at White Pine. I worked in the oil fields. I had guys fall out of the derricks because the companies didn't provide safety measures. I had guys on the pipeline get buried alive when I worked in the oil fields, okay? But along the line, it's the decisions by the bureaucracy. When this coal company, 29 miners got killed down there, they find out they got a double set of books, okay? They had the money to hire the lawyers to go in, but the little guy on the bottom. Now, I worked in the woods for a long time. Now I find to cut my own timber, I got to go back to school to get a schooling, because they say, oh no. You go to the other one and say, oh yes you do. By the time I go through this bureaucracy, I'm dead or bankrupt. And this is the idea, when these people make the wrong decisions along this line, they should be held accountable, they should be fired, so that somebody else doesn't go through the same procedure. And I can give you a hell of a lot of examples along that same line. One good example is, you remember at White Pine I talked with you, everybody talking about trade with China. I can't sell my cattle to Wisconsin. You promised me. Yeah, we'll work on that, Pat. I understand it takes a long time. But it's a thing like that. 5 years from now, I've been working on that 5 years. I still can't sell my cattle in Wisconsin 200 miles away. I got to sell them downstate, haul them 700 miles, and you sell a truckload of cattle down there. You know what the buyers say? Well, here's what we'll give him. He's not going to hire them back. It's the bureaucracy that has accumulated, and the hell with the decision, because there's no penalties on these people if they're wrong. I got in a real bind because I followed up on it. Friend of mine, we set it up. Call the inspector downstate on the cattle. He said, well, yeah, okay. You go through on this date and it's okay. But if I send them down and say, no, you got to stop at the bridge and have an inspector come there and wait there for 2 or 3 days, it's the bureaucracy along the line that's making the wrong decision. And if we fight them and you win, so what? You're bankrupt. You're bankrupt. This is the policy. You should be able to question your government. And I know, like this gentleman tells me, don't talk too much, Pat. It's because I've been involved in these things. And so I know them, you know. Like, why should I have to go back to school? I should be teaching these guys how to cut timber. Not going back to school. And then one of the criticisms I get, yeah, you wear braces. Well, you shouldn't be. Bullshit.
Well,
so I'm almost 80 and I want to work.
There's a lot of people in the Michigan's 1st District that agree with you on these sorts of issues. And what I can tell you is that I'm trying at every place I have an opportunity to get voted is to cut the bureaucracy, to cut the duplication of services, and to make those people more responsible for what they're doing.
I understand it's hard. I understand it. But
Question.
Oh, you know what? Could you follow up with Tracy after the meeting about your issue with the border?
One question. What is their national total debt? Is it?
It's like 14 trillion, nearly 15 trillion dollars at the end of this year.
Then when we add the entitlements to it, where are we at now?
Well, you saw that. With that
I saw that. But
forward.
what are we talking about in the absolute, in the conclusion?
Well, if we don't do something, we're going to be,
okay,
$70 trillion in debt.
Okay, we are about 80 trillion, I understand, in debt right now with the entitlements.
15.
With
right
the
at this current
entitlements.
time. But if you go forward without changing the future, without changing the rules, we're looking at the line that you saw there before.
Well, that's what's been happening, but I'm just curious, what is nobody seems to exactly want to say or don't know whatever it is, but nevertheless, the talk is that it's at 80 trillion right now,
Well,
with the entitlements.
well, going forward, depending on how many years you go forward, you
I
get a different
understand that,
number.
and I think everybody
it's on that
understands that,
slope
but
that you
nevertheless,
saw there.
when we think of this and we talk about the balancing of the budget, we better look at those numbers seriously to see if that possibility is out there.
At the beginning, we did the house budget. Okay, we did this house budget. Okay, and the house budget, doesn't raise taxes. It cuts certain programs. It deals with Medicare and Social Security. It doesn't affect current holders, and it balances the budget over 40 years. So I mean, it's a long time. It's not like this year, but it puts us on a slope that is just, that we can sustain over the long term. So, I'm happy to hear somebody else's ideas. I voted, for some of the Democrat amendments to the budget. I voted against some of the Republican. I voted against the defense appropriation because I just thought it was too expensive. We can't just not cut defense. A lot of the Republicans, they just don't want to cut anything in defense. And I don't believe that why are we, providing a military for Germany? Why do we have military bases in South Korea, a very vibrant economy? They should be paying for their own defense. I mean, France and Germany can't even beat Libya on their own, for crying out loud.
Well,
You know what I mean? So that's sort of ridiculous.
There's other questions, so thank you.
Yes, sir.
Are you for mining in the UP?
Yeah. I want to have, a safe environment, but I believe that we need to develop the resources that we have here.
So I say, what can I do? Because we're thinking about, if I remember properly, that the budget was, if I remember listening to the news or whatever, that what they believed, as they advised the President of the United States, was that the financial problems of America and its deficit could be a risk or a threat of Homeland Security, because with limited funding, they have limited resources to defend against problems of anger from other nations that are maybe opposed to the policies of the United States. So this is when it becomes mandatory for the United States to get involved, and I guess they write laws that this becomes then part of the situation to keep budget within measures so that they can defend the United States, because that is the primary function of the government, is to defend the people.
Well, I certainly agree that our economic strength is the basis of our global security. So we have to maintain our economic strength, because that's the forefront of our national defense.
So what if the deficit was reduced? What if it was erased, and what if it was established in surplus? Then would they do what Wisconsin did when we worked on their budget and use that money improperly? I think what they did.
I can't say what's going to happen in the future. I'm going to try to.
If they had, say, $100 trillion in surplus, would they then know how to govern? Because I talked to Washington, and I'm thinking about this and that, and I'm thinking, well, it's not that difficult to erase a deficit. I've done it a number of times as I've helped and volunteered my services. It's not that difficult to eliminate a deficit. What is difficult is to govern a surplus. Because what they did with that surplus was so inappropriate that that surplus was never.
Well, I'm hoping that it's going to be as easy as you suggest, but I don't see that it's going to be.
It is not that difficult. I can explain very.
Let me go on. Let me go on to this gentleman.
Congressman,
Yeah.
time for one question.
All right.
Okay, I'll make this real quick. When it comes to, like the raising the taxes on the wealthy and everything, I'm not saying like the 250,000, but why was the top 2% taken off the table? I realize that the wealthy create the jobs in this country. We need that. There's nothing wrong with living the American dream and becoming somewhat wealthy. But the top 2%, if that would have been on the table, I bet you the Senate would have acted.
Well, a lot of the problems with it come from the fact that small businesses are affected a lot from this. It's not the taxes of the personal income. It's the taxes from the S corporations that people put their money back into their business. And that's the taxes that we don't want to raise taxes on those people.
That's right.
And that's the basis of our,
2%.
I want people that make a lot of money to be paying their share of taxes. I mean, I think we should eliminate loopholes so that people who are making $1 million a year don't pay any taxes. Okay, that's wrong.
Even $1 million a year, if they're running a small business and employing people, that's one thing.
But if they keep their money in their business, is different than if they take it home and spend it on a boat. Okay?
That's true too.
So I want everybody to be paying their fair share, but there's a lot of argument, there's a lot of rhetoric, there's a lot of anger that's out there. I'm really trying to do what I think is the right thing to do. And people,
but at the same time, if you can't tax that top 2%, and yet you can take people's social security benefits and cut them and stuff like that, how can you look at me with all good conscience and say that that's the right thing to do? I voted Republican my entire life. My conscience will not allow me to do it again because of that.
How come General Electric doesn't pay any taxes and still gets all of these billions of dollars
And ExxonMobil and Bank of America.
And cutting jobs while they're at it.
To allow that to occur. Unfortunately, I got to be on the road. I really appreciate you all coming here. I do listen to what you're having to say. We may not agree on every issue, but I'm here. I'm happy to listen. Tracy's going to stay for a while to address any individual concerns. If you do have a problem with the federal government on a particular personal issue, please be in touch with our office. We do have some cards out here with some contact information.
They hung up the phone on me and wouldn't let me talk.
So
Thank you for coming, Mr. Thomas, and I
I'm
appreciate
happy.
it.
They banned me from talking to
Thank you
your
very
office.
much. Good job.
They
Very
banned me
good
from
job.
talking to your office.
All right, thank you all.
They banned